When I was very young, I was fascinated with exotic phenomena of every kind, which of course includes things like dinosaurs, insects, storms, lightning, the sun, language, anomalies, and particularly topics that lie on the border of what we're capable of analyzing. These would be some kinds of human experience. For example, the possibility of having known the mind of another person, or known of their experience when you couldn't have. Sudden, inexplicable feats of extraordinary skill or ability. Topics such as the existence of in-between kinds of things, things that are neither properly organisms nor fairy tale spirit beings, but maybe have some qualities of both and yet are real, in the sense of you could encounter one and not merely be hallucinating in that sense. And perhaps the topics that surround UFOs. We might include things like near-death experience, but I think that's a rather iffy one for complex reasons. Not that we should exclude the figures, but we might not want to believe what they're talking about. So I was very interested in exotic phenomena, and that interest grew throughout my lifetime. And I had a kind of a first-person relationship with this interest. That is, rather than merely being one who researches and does a lot of reading and such, I was very interested in phenomena directly, and I explored them myself with my own mind, my own questions, my own imagination. And the one experience that I most dearly hoped for, and was also fairly certain was impossible to have, was the experience of contact with an advanced non-human intelligence. Strangely, there are a lot of ordinary topics that orbit this pivot. All the topics of religion orbit this pivot. They all orbit the pivot of there is another domain of something that is even beyond intelligence. And of course, it's useful to define what intelligence is, and very difficult, since it's extremely difficult to separate a definition of intelligence from its obvious inaction, right? The action of intelligence is rather different from descriptions of it. These are different orders of phenomenon. And this becomes very important when we're thinking about topics like this. We might imagine these are a peculiar class of topics. I'll get to that in a moment. As most of us are aware, and any who are interested are certainly aware, there are thousands of reports of contact between human beings and anomalous phenomenon. A subclass of these definitively identify as contact with some kind of other intelligence, perhaps an intelligence that actually uses vehicles of some kind to travel in, and an intelligence that has some analog of what we understand as technology, though I don't necessarily believe that what would represent technology to an advanced non-human intelligence would be similar to what represents technology to human intelligences. I suspect they would be very different, possibly different orders of phenomenon. In any case, there are many reports of contact between human beings and what appears to be, from our interpretive perspective, some kind of non-human advanced intelligence, possibly from space, possibly from another dimension, possibly from a spiritual dimension, yet it seems slightly unlikely that we've got that idea right, if that's true. And there's a really weird feature of all of these contact events. Nothing interesting gets transmitted to the humans. They don't come back with any kind of intelligence, right? Whereas I know for a fact that if I met some kind of other intelligence, the result of that contact would produce, on both sides, very interesting, how should we put it, artifacts of knowledge transmission, right? So that we might imagine that anyone who'd actually had contact with a non-human intelligence would return with a very different mind, and all kinds of ways to shockingly demonstrate this, and maybe even make it contagious, the same way that we do with the paradigms and frameworks and schemas that we invent here, right? We would get paradigms and schemas and frameworks from another intelligence, a whole other perspective on reality, and all of the little branches of the tree of knowledge. Such a moment would be absolutely staggering in its potential, and yet there's no evidence of it ever having happened. I find that very, very suspicious and very peculiar. My point, though, is a little more focused, even though I'm walking around it in wide orbits. One of the gifts we might imagine that we would bring back from such an encounter would be familiarity with something I'm going to call a hypertopic. A hypertopic is a topic of another order to those that humans ordinarily play with and are familiar with, yet they're available to us. In fact, nature is a hypertopic. What nature is, what time is, what light is, what life and death are, these are all hypertopics, but those are not the kind I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that you can play with your imagination, that every time you play with it, changes your ability to play with any other topic, advances it dramatically, and in fact can advance itself, so that it acquires an even more explosive order of this power each time you play with it. Now, I won't be able to give you one of those here today, but I can introduce you easily to the concept of a hypertopic. And I'll show you just how strange it is. And it has to do with a hypertopic has to be a topic that has to do with everything at once. So that there's nothing you can look at, there's no direction you can look, that this topic doesn't somehow inform it very centrally, or perhaps even contain it, right? And so the one we're going to play with involves a series of visual or geometric models, a model of descent, from potential down a little stairway or ladder into a derivation. And this topic is so strange that it applies to everything you can do or think. And it also, studying it, produces understandings that are otherwise unavailable. Were we to encounter a non-human intelligence, what we would bring back might be something very much like what we're about to play with here. Let's get started. So what I want you to imagine to begin with is a shape. You can imagine it a bit like a very irregular soap bubble that is being blown from a loop. And it is always changing, it never separates from the loop, it's always being blown in this bubble. And it has lots of strange little how shall we say, protuberances, bumps, dips, tunnels, tentacles, and some of them repenetrate it. It's a very strange little monster. But it's changing all the time. So it's essentially an extremely irregular, dynamic metasphere, right? So we're going to start there. We're going to call that changing bubble shape a manifold. It represents a cloud-like body of potential for various kinds of derivation paths that produce various kinds of derivations without collapsing the manifold. So what happens is, as you extend into or away from the manifold in its own body, the manifold starts to turn into less dynamic, more static structure. Yeah? And what we can see, I'm going to first demonstrate a series of visual steps. So go from the manifold, imagine that the manifold becomes, and by the way, notice that loop from which this manifold is emerging. The little loop through which the bubble is being blown, right? Something's coming in through this loop and dynamizing this bubble, so to speak. So what we're going to do is break it away from the loop for a moment, and the moment that we do that, it's likely, as we can see with soap bubbles, to become a sphere. Yeah? Now, if we remove one of the perspectives on the sphere, we get a disk. And if we view that disk from straight on, above, below, or any side, it looks like a line. Right? And we can identify the center of that line and collapse the sphere to that line, collapse the sphere to a disk, the disk to a line, and then the line to a point. And this demonstrates a series of transformations whereby potential becomes structure, derivatives, statics, words, names, concepts, and even persons. So let me explain how strange this topic is. In order to make the language that I'm making right now in this recording, I'm doing that process with language. I'm taking all the potentials of language, all the potentials of speaking, and collapsing them through a series of transitions to the specific words and deliverables that I'm producing right now, without knowing anything about that process or ordinarily being aware of it. Similarly, I'm doing the same thing with my personality, right? Of all the personalities I might adopt, we might say that I collapse through a series of transformations to personate one specific personality right now. All of the different forms of life on Earth represent specific domains of descent that nonetheless comprise a unity. Each one of them can be understood as a collapsing of the manifold of the possibilities of life into the specific instances, orders, relationships, and so on of the actual organisms here on Earth. All of mathematics is specifically how do you get from everything to one in millions of different ways in very complex little dances. So all of it has to do with collapsing the manifold into specific derivatives and schemata that bear the signature of the transformations. Dimensionality itself is oriented in a way much like the toy we've made. When children play, when adults make love, when humans make war, when we build cultures, we're always seeing the collapse of this manifold. The culture collapses from a state of many potentials into little subsections and concerns. These become individual minds. The manifold of all the possibilities of knowledge collapses into branches, ways of knowing, and these collapse into specific produce and derivatives, actual language, demonstrations, schemata, right? So that we're looking at something, strangely here, a topic that relates to all possible topics. It's a super topic. And yet, we already have a toy of it we can play with. A toy that should be obvious to everyone, yet nearly none of us were ever given. What would it mean to have skill with this toy? What would it mean to understand something technical about the nature of these transformations and what happens when we fall, for example, into the derivatives at the very bottom and then begin to see as them? Now, this is a very common problem with our kind of animal. Once we have language, it's so compelling that we are prone to see, to sort of fall down into the derivative. In other words, the order above the derivatives, above the toys of language that would normally interpret or create it, author it, right, has fallen down into the language and now sees as it, and demands that other people, or even ecologies, do what the language says should be done. Now, obviously, this is a very crude position, and we can see immediately that there are two different styles of play. One of them preserves the status of the intelligence, the living intelligence, that stands above the lower order derivatives, and another style of confusion collapses that intelligence into them. And we can see examples of this in certain ideas. One of those ideas is the idea that a machine can be intelligent. This is very obviously, clearly impossible for the reason that you cannot collapse the mind from which machines and algorithms emerge as a minor possibility into one of the derivatives. That would be like saying, if you make language complex enough, if you made a library complex enough, it'll become a mind. It's never going to happen, no matter how complex that library is. Minds don't happen at that order of derivative. Huh? Another really interesting one is the idea that the universe is a hologram. This is hilarious. So let's take it seriously for a moment. What is a hologram? Well, a hologram is something that has a lower degree of dimensionality, and when viewed in a certain way, gains another degree of dimensionality, so that a 2D representation viewed a certain way appears to be three-dimensional. And the essential model of, what is it like, is that it is like a peculiar kind of photograph. But it's a recursive photograph, so that each of the elements in some way contains all of some aspect or a reflection of all of the other elements. Now, what would it mean for the universe to be a hologram? Well, what it would mean would be you'd have a hologram that had the makers of the hologram dynamically alive inside it, making it every time they moved their eyes. So in other words, what happens when you say the universe is a hologram is that, first of all, you pretend that it's a static artifact like a photograph, which is insane. But it can look that way in language. If you've collapsed into language, it looks like it's possible. The second thing, though, is that the mind that would normally overstand the artifact and build the camera and take the photograph and make it disappears. It's just thrown into the product. It's somewhere in the product now, which is, of course, impossible. If the universe were a hologram, it would be the weirdest kind of hologram where every single organism was simultaneously dynamically inventing the hologram, representing the entire hologram, collapsing the hologram, and transforming it. There is certainly no hologram like that. Nor could there ever be an artifact in which being is immanent in that way, right? And yet the universe is obviously filled with immanent. It is the immanence of being. Nothing like the strange little model that language produces, that when we fall into it, we suddenly become confused. Yes, if we are just artifacts, of course everything can just be artifacts. but it is impossible that minds are artifacts. Noticing the peculiar features of the hypertopic I've been orbiting here, we've been playing with, protects us from this kind of gambit and allows us to see that the manifold never fits way down in the derivatives, right? The origin, the pure undifferentiated potential of origin, which is capital O, is never found at the orders of pure structure, static structure, naming, derivatives, descriptions, analyses, and such like this. It's simply its dimensionality can't exist down there, right? In the same way that the dimensionality of a mind can't exist in a book. The dimensionality of a language can't exist in a word, right? So, isn't it interesting that having never necessarily encountered a non-human intelligence, we can discover and play with hypertopics together? This is a subject that fascinates me endlessly, and one that I learned from a direct encounter with the kinds of intelligence that I think we've always dreamt and hoped and feared having contact with. Quite surprisingly, the very ordinary organisms and processes of nature, ants and bees, birds, cats, dogs, trees, living places, lakes and ponds, are exactly what we were thinking about when we looked to the sky and wondered, are there other minds out there? Strangely, what we're looking for is not only what's all around us and what we're made of, but it's far deeper and more advanced than what the toys and cartoons we've made of it look like. I encourage you to, without any of the ideas from culture, go directly to nature and re-establish contact. Perhaps the hypertopic we've played with here today may be of some use in this task. I think our humanity and the possibility of our intelligence depends upon it.